The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked pavement outside Elite Motorworks, casting long shadows across the cluttered repair shop where three mechanics worked on expensive cars. Brandon, the youngest mechanic at 23, wiped grease from his hands as he watched a figure approach the entrance. The man was black, probably in his 50s, with clothes that had seen better days and gray hair that hadn't known a comb in weeks. But those eyes held something that Brandon couldn't quite place. A strange intensity as they fixed on the red Ferrari 458 that had been sitting with its engine exposed for 5 straight days. Inside the shop, Oliver Martinez, the owner, barely glanced up from his paperwork when he spotted the approaching figure. His expensive watch glinted as he gestured dismissively toward the door. "Kevin, call security," he said to his senior mechanic, a man with 15 years of experience who prided himself on knowing every sound an engine could make. "These people show up here every day asking for handouts. I'm running a business, not a charity." But the man at the door raised his hand peacefully, his voice carrying an unexpected authority that seemed to cut through the noise of grinding tools and running engines. "I'm not asking for money," he said calmly, his words measured and clear. "I'm asking for work. I can fix that Ferrari in exchange for a meal." The entire shop erupted in laughter that echoed off the concrete walls. Brandon nearly dropped the wrench he was holding, while Kevin shook his head in disbelief, his weathered face creasing with what he thought was amusement. "Did you guys hear that?" Kevin shouted to his colleagues, pointing at the stranger. "This beggar thinks he can fix a $250,000 Ferrari." The laughter grew louder, but the man stood unmoved, his posture straight despite his worn appearance. His eyes continued to scan the exposed engine with a precision that went unnoticed by everyone except Emma Rodriguez, the only female employee in the shop, who watched the entire scene unfold from her position near the diagnostic computers. Something about the way he held himself, the way he analyzed the mechanical components, stirred her curiosity in ways she couldn't explain. "What's wrong with the car?" the man asked, completely ignoring the waves of laughter washing over him. His question was direct, professional, spoken like someone who had asked it 1,000 times before. Oliver finally stood up from his chair, irritation flashing across his face like storm clouds gathering before rain. "The problem," he said, walking closer with deliberate steps, "is that you're in my shop acting like you have some right to be. Here, you're disturbing my customers and my workers." But the man didn't respond to the provocation or step back from Oliver's aggressive approach. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, listening with intense concentration as Kevin started the Ferrari's engine for another failed diagnostic test. "Direct injection system," the man said with the same calm tone he'd maintained since arriving. "Fuel pressure regulator malfunction. That's why the engine cuts out at high RPMs. It's not a mechanical issue, it's electronic. The fuel management computer is receiving inconsistent data." The silence that followed was so complete that Emma could hear her own heartbeat. Kevin had spent 5 days searching for exactly this type of fault, running diagnostic after diagnostic, checking every mechanical component twice. The idea that someone could identify the problem just by listening seemed impossible. Yet something in the man's confidence made Emma wonder. "Just by listening?" Brandon asked, his mocking tone replaced by genuine curiosity. How could anyone possibly know that just from the engine sound? Oliver quickly stepped forward, his arrogance returning, as he tried to regain control of the situation that was slipping away from him. "Lucky guess," he declared, loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Anyone can throw out technical terms and hope something sticks. It's an old con artist trick." The man smiled for the first time since arriving, and Emma noticed that the expression carried traces of memories from better times, like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds. "It wasn't a guess," he said, his voice taking on an educational tone that sounded natural, practiced. That specific noise happens when the regulator sends inconsistent pressure readings to the fuel management system. The computer shuts down. Injection to certain cylinders as a safety measure, which causes the power loss and stalling. It's a common problem in this model when the fuel filter hasn't been changed according to the maintenance schedule. Emma found herself moving closer, drawn by the technical explanation and the confidence with which he delivered it. She knew these systems were incredibly complex, requiring years of specialized training to fully understand. "And how do you know so much about Ferrari engines?" she asked, ignoring the angry looks from her male colleagues who clearly didn't appreciate her interest in the stranger's knowledge. The man hesitated for a moment, as if deciding how much of himself to reveal to these people who had shown him nothing but contempt. "I've worked with high-performance sports cars before," he said eventually, his answer careful and measured. "Where, exactly?" Oliver asked sarcastically, crossing his arms across his chest. "At some junkyard somewhere." More laughter filled the workshop, but this time the man's expression didn't change. For just an instant, something dark and painful flashed through his old wound that he carried like invisible weight on his shoulders. Various places over the years, he replied evasively, but Emma caught the way his hands trembled. Slightly, not with nervousness, but with something deeper, like someone fighting to keep painful memories locked away. "Look, I can prove I'm right about the regulator. I just need access to a proper diagnostic computer." Brandon pointed toward an expensive machine sitting in the corner of the workshop, its screen dark and imposing. "You mean you actually know how to use a professional OBD scanner? Those things cost more than most people make in a year." The answer came without hesitation, simple and confident. "I do." There was something in those two words that made even Oliver pause, though he couldn't have explained why. The certainty was absolute, like someone stating their own name. "All right," Oliver said finally, a cruel smile spreading across his face. As he pulled out his smartphone, "I'll give you exactly one chance. If you diagnose the problem correctly, I'll give you $50 and a sandwich. But if you're wrong, and you will be wrong, never want to see you near my shop again. And I'm going to film the whole thing to post online so everyone can see what happens when people try to pretend they're something they're not." The man nodded calmly, as if bets like this were routine in his life, just another day in a world that had forgotten how to see past appearances. But as he walked toward the diagnostic machine, Emma noticed something the others missed completely. His hands weren't shaking with nervousness about the test ahead. They were shaking with barely contained emotion, like someone who is about to reveal a part of himself that he'd kept hidden for a very long time. He stood there in front of all those contemptuous stares and cruel grins, holding himself steady like someone who possessed a secret too powerful to be revealed before the right moment arrived. The weight of years seemed to settle on his shoulders. As he approached the machine that would either vindicate him or confirm their worst assumptions about who he really was. The diagnostic scanner came to life with a sharp electronic beep that cut through the tension like a knife. Everyone in the shop crowded around to watch what they expected would be an embarrassing spectacle, their faces showing the kind of anticipation people get when they think they're about to witness someone else's humiliation. Oliver held his phone up, recording every movement as Brandon and Kevin placed quiet bets on how long it would take for the homeless man to give up and admit he was in over his head. $20 says he doesn't even know how to connect the cable properly, Kevin whispered to Brandon, but his voice was loud enough to carry across the small space. Another 20 says he starts pressing random buttons and hopes for the best. But the man connected the diagnostic cable to the Ferrari's OBD port with movements so smooth and practiced that Emma found herself leaning forward to get a better look. His fingers navigated the scanner's complex menu system like they were extensions of his own thoughts, accessing diagnostic levels that Kevin rarely used despite his 15 years of experience. The menus flashed by with purpose and direction, each selection made without hesitation or second-guessing. Impossible, Brandon muttered under his breath, when he watched the man dive directly into the engine management system using access codes that weren't printed in any manual. How does he know these sequences? Those codes are restricted to factory-certified technicians. The man ignored every comment and whispered conversation happening around him, his complete focus locked on the scanner's bright screen. For several long minutes, the only sounds in the workshop were the electronic beeps and clicks of the diagnostic equipment as he navigated through layers of technical data at a speed that impressed even Emma, who considered herself highly skilled with automotive computers. His eyes moved across the readouts like he was reading a familiar book, processing information that would take most mechanics hours to understand. "There it is," he said finally, pointing to a specific line on the screen with the confidence of someone who had found exactly what he was looking for. Error code P0190. Fuel rail pressure sensor circuit malfunction. Just exactly as I said it would be. The silence that followed was so profound that Emma could hear the traffic passing on the street outside. Kevin approached the diagnostic machine with reluctant steps, checked the reading displayed on the screen, and his face drained of all color like someone had just told him impossible news. That's exactly right," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. 5 days of testing and checking, and this guy identified the problem in less than 10 minutes. Oliver quickly put his smartphone away, clearly frustrated that he hadn't gotten the humiliating footage he'd hoped to capture and share with the world. "Beginner's luck," he muttered, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried just minutes before. Anyone can get lucky once if they press enough buttons. "Random buttons?" the man asked, turning to face Oliver directly for the first time since the test began. There was something dangerous in his eyes now, a quiet intensity that made Oliver unconsciously take a step backward. "Would you like me to explain why this particular sensor fails on this model when the fuel system isn't maintained according to the factory specifications? I can tell you about the cascade of problems this car will have in the next 6 months if the underlying issues aren't addressed properly." The question caught Oliver completely off guard, exposing the limits of his own technical knowledge in front of his employees and the stranger he'd been trying to humiliate. Brandon tried to help his boss regain control of the rapidly deteriorating situation. "Okay, maybe you got lucky this one time, but making one good guess doesn't make you a real mechanic. This is still a professional shop, not a place for people to play around with expensive equipment. A lucky guess," the man repeated, and his smile held no warmth or humor whatsoever. "I can identify 3 other potential failures this Ferrari will experience in the next year if the maintenance history isn't corrected. I can tell you why the previous owner probably sold it, and I can predict which systems will need replacement. Based on the wear patterns I observed while you had the engine running." Emma felt her professional curiosity completely take over her sense of workplace politics. "How could you possibly know all of that from such a brief examination?" she asked, moving closer despite the disapproving looks from her colleagues. "The level of expertise you're displaying suggests years of specialized experience with these exact systems." The man hesitated again, that same internal struggle playing across his features as he decided how much truth he was willing to share. "Because I've seen this exact pattern of failures hundreds of times before," he said carefully. "Ferrari 458 models from 2010 to 2015 have a very predictable sequence of problems when they're not properly maintained by people who understand their unique requirements." Kevin shook his head in complete disbelief, his professional pride stinging from being outperformed so easily. "Hundreds of times?" he demanded. "Where the hell could you have worked that you've seen hundreds of Ferraris? These aren't exactly Common cars that show up at regular repair shops every day. Places where cars like this were normal, not exceptional, the man replied. His answer deliberately vague, but somehow carrying enormous weight. Oliver didn't like the direction this conversation was taking at all. He was losing control of the situation, and his authority was being questioned by someone who should have been grateful for the chance to earn a sandwich. The power dynamic had shifted in ways he couldn't understand or accept. "Listen here, old man," he said, stepping forward aggressively, trying to use his physical presence to regain dominance. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but this is a serious repair facility. We don't need party tricks or lucky guesses to impress our customers or maintain our reputation." "Party tricks?" the man asked, his voice dropping to almost a whisper as he stared Oliver straight in the eyes. "Would you like to see what real expertise looks like?" Before anyone could respond or object, he walked over to a white BMW M5 that had been sitting in the far corner of the shop for 3 weeks. Its hood propped open and its engine bay surrounded by scattered tools and diagnostic equipment. "That car over there," he said, pointing at the BMW without breaking eye contact with Oliver. "You told the customer it needs a complete engine rebuild, didn't you? Quoted them $18,000 for the work." Oliver's face went rigid with tension. It was true, but how could this stranger possibly know about private conversations? With customers, the BMW had been his biggest frustration in months, a problem that seemed to have no solution despite weeks of investigation. "The problem isn't the engine," the man continued, his voice gaining strength and authority with every word. "It's the high-pressure fuel pump, a $1,200 part that's failing intermittently. You're trying to charge the customer $16,800 for unnecessary work because you can't properly diagnose electronic fuel injection systems." Brandon swallowed hard, his face showing a mixture of amazement and growing concern. "How could you possibly know that just from looking at the car from across the room? You haven't even touched it or run any tests." The man walked over to the BMW with purpose and confidence, his movements showing none of the hesitation or uncertainty they'd expected from someone in his apparent circumstances. "I can prove it right now," he said, opening the hood and pointing to specific components. With surgical precision. "Look at these fuel rail connections, the carbon buildup here, the oxidation patterns on these lines. These are classic symptoms of high-pressure pump failure that's been developing over several months." Emma watched in fascination as Kevin reluctantly connected another diagnostic scanner to the BMW and ran a comprehensive fuel system test. When the results appeared on the screen, Kevin's face turned bright red with embarrassment and something approaching shame. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, staring at the data that confirmed exactly what the stranger had predicted. "The fuel pump is operating at 60% of normal pressure. If we had caught this 3 weeks ago, we could have saved the customer thousands of dollars and prevented additional damage to the fuel injectors." "My God," Emma said quietly, understanding the full implications of what had just happened. "If he's right about this diagnosis, we were about to overcharge a customer by almost $17,000 for work that wasn't necessary. That's not just bad business, that could destroy someone's financial life." The moral weight of the situation settled over the shop like a heavy blanket. And suddenly, the stranger's shabby appearance seemed completely irrelevant compared to the expertise he was demonstrating and the integrity he was showing. Oliver realized he was losing control of everything he'd built his reputation on. His diagnostic skills were being shown up by a homeless man. His business practices were being exposed as potentially fraudulent. And his employees were starting to look at him with expressions he'd never seen before. "It's just another coincidence," he said desperately. But his voice cracked with the strain of maintaining a position that was becoming impossible to defend. 2 lucky guesses in a row don't prove anything except that he's good at gambling." The Man turned to stare at Oliver with a look that made the shop owner's blood run cold. For a moment, Oliver saw something in those eyes that he recognized on an instinctive level, the quiet authority of someone who had commanded respect, who had led teams of people who had been looked up to and trusted with enormous responsibilities. It was the look of someone who had once held power and position, who understood exactly what Oliver was trying to do and found it contemptible. Coincidence? The man repeated slowly, letting the word hang in the air like an accusation. Like when you said my first diagnosis was beginner's luck? Like when you assumed I was here to beg for money instead of offering to work for food? The tension in the workshop had become so thick that Emma felt like she was struggling to breathe normally. She had the overwhelming sense that she was witnessing something much more significant than a simple disagreement about automotive repair. There were layers to this situation that she didn't understand yet. Currents of meaning and history flowing beneath the surface of what appeared to be a straightforward encounter between a shop owner and a potential customer. "Do you still want to give me that $50 in sandwich?" the man asked Oliver, his tone carrying a subtle mockery that made the offer sound both generous and insulting at the same time. Oliver tried to summon his earlier arrogance, but it felt forced and artificial now. "Or are you going to keep pretending that you're some kind of automotive genius who just happened to wander in off the street?" he asked, but the sarcasm sounded desperate rather than confident. The man was silent for several long seconds, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a deep sadness that made Emma feel like something cold had touched her heart. "I've been many things in my life," he said calmly, his words weighted with experiences none of them could imagine. "But I've never pretended to be something I wasn't. The world has a way of teaching you the difference between who you are and who people think you should be." He started walking toward the door with slow, measured steps. But Oliver couldn't let him leave not like this, not after being shown up so completely in front of his own employees. The humiliation he'd planned to film and share had backfired spectacularly, and his pride demanded some kind of response. "Hey, wait just a minute," Oliver shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "You can't just walk in here, show off with a couple of diagnostic tricks, and then leave like you're some kind of hero who's too good for honest work." The man stopped at the door without turning around, his shoulders carrying the weight of exhaustion that went far beyond physical tiredness. "Heroes don't exist," he replied, his voice so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear him. "There are only people who have lost everything they ever cared about and still try to help others when they have the chance." He pushed through the door and walked out into the afternoon sun, leaving behind a heavy silence and 4 people who were beginning to suspect they had just encountered someone far more complex and significant than his appearance had suggested. The shop felt different somehow, as if his presence had revealed something uncomfortable about the way they saw the world and their place in it. Emma ran to the window and watched him, walking slowly down the street, his hands deep in his pockets, and his shoulders hunched like someone carrying an invisible burden that never got lighter. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw him stop in front of a telephone pole covered with missing person flyers. Those faded photographs that became part of the urban landscape until they were forgotten by everyone except the families who had posted them. What she couldn't see from her position at the window was the single tear that ran down his face as he recognized something in one of those photographs. Something that connected to a part of his life that he'd never been able to leave behind. Every perfect diagnosis he'd made, every moment of humiliation he'd accepted without fighting back. Every day he'd spent living on the streets, was all part of a penance he had imposed on himself for a tragedy that still consumed him from the inside. But what the arrogant mechanics at Elite Motor Works couldn't possibly know was that they had just encountered someone who had already lost everything once. And when you have nothing left to lose, each new injustice only feeds a determination that other people can't comprehend. The man they had mocked and dismissed was about to teach them a lesson about the true cost of prejudice. And the education was going to be more expensive than any of them could afford. Emma couldn't sleep that night, her mind racing with questions that demanded answers. Something about the way the man had analyzed those cars, the surgical precision of his diagnoses, the way he navigated complex electronic systems like they were second nature. It all hammered at her consciousness like a persistent drumbeat. The next morning, she arrived at the shop 2 hours early and went straight to the computer system, driven by a suspicion that was growing stronger with each passing hour. If her instincts were correct, it would be digital traces of the extraordinary technical knowledge he had displayed, evidence that would explain how someone could possess such specialized expertise. Direct injection systems, fuel pressure regulators, high-pressure fuel pumps, she muttered to herself, typing the specific terms he had used with such confidence. Ferrari 458, BMW M5, electronic fuel management. The search results that appeared on her screen left her speechless and shaking. These weren't specifications that any ordinary mechanic would know by heart. Even experienced professionals who worked on high-end cars every day. They were technical details that only specialized engineers or professional race car drivers would have complete mastery of. Information that required years of hands-on experience with the most advanced automotive systems in the world. Brandon arrived to find her still hunched over the computer, her eyes red from staring at the screen for hours. "Emma, what the hell are you doing here so early?" he asked, pouring coffee from the machine in the corner. "Did you even go home last night?" She turned the monitor toward him, her finger pointing at forum discussions and technical papers that painted a picture of expertise far beyond anything they had imagined. "Look at these automotive engineering forums," she said, her voice tight with excitement and disbelief. "The specifications he mentioned yesterday are only discussed in very specific circles. Formula One technical teams, prototype racing engineers, people who work with million-dollar machines that push the absolute limits of automotive technology." "So what?" Brandon said, but his casual dismissal sounded forced. "Anyone can read technical information on the internet these days. You can find anything if you spend enough time searching." Emma shook her head, pulling up more detailed information. That made her heart race with the implications of what she was discovering. Brandon, he knew diagnostic codes from memory. Didn't look anything up or reference any manuals. He knew it the way you know your own phone number automatically, without thinking about it. That kind of knowledge comes from years of practical experience, not from reading articles online. Oliver arrived at that moment, overhearing the end of their conversation and immediately becoming defensive. "Are you two still obsessing over that crazy homeless guy?" he demanded, his voice carrying the irritation of someone whose authority had been challenged and found wanting. "For God's sake, forget about him already. It was luck, coincidence, whatever you want to call it, but it wasn't real skill. People like that don't have the education or experience to work on cars worth more than most people's houses." But Emma had discovered something that made her hands tremble as she navigated to a specialized racing forum from 2008. "Oliver, you need to look at this," she insisted, her voice cutting through his protests with an urgency that made him pause. On the screen was a forum discussion where a user named GhostDriver_44 had posted incredibly detailed technical analyses of the exact same automotive problems that the stranger had diagnosed the day before. This person here was predicting these exact failure patterns 15 years ago, before these models were even widely available to the public. Look at the level of technical detail, the understanding of systems that hadn't even been fully documented yet. The workshop door opened at that exact moment, and the man from yesterday reappeared. But this time, he wasn't alone. An elegantly dressed woman in her 60s accompanied him, someone who clearly didn't belong in their working-class neighborhood. Her clothes were expensive, her jewelry was real, and she carried herself with the confidence that came from significant wealth and social position. "Good morning," the man said with the same calm politeness he'd shown before, as if the previous day's humiliation had never happened. "This is Victoria Hamilton, owner of a McLaren 720S that your shop declared to be beyond economic repair last month." Oliver felt his stomach drop as he recognized the name and remembered the case. It had been his most expensive failure in recent SOAR memory, a $600,000 McLaren, with an electronic problem that no repair facility in the city had been able to solve. The car had been passed from shop to shop like a mechanical hot potato, each place declaring it hopeless and adding to Ms. Hamilton's growing frustration with the automotive repair industry. "Ms. Hamilton," Oliver stammered, his professional composure cracking under the pressure of an unexpected and potentially disastrous situation. "What are you doing here with him?" Victoria smiled, but there was nothing warm about the expression. It was the cold, calculating smile of someone who had been wealthy long enough to recognize incompetence when she saw it and had the power to do something about it. "I met this gentleman last evening in the parking lot of my hotel," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "When I mentioned the ongoing problems with my car, he provided me with a technical explanation so accurate and comprehensive that I decided to bring him here personally to see if he could succeed where your shop and for others had failed completely." "He gave you a technical explanation about a McLaren?" Karen asked incredulously, his voice cracking with disbelief. "Those cars have computer systems more complex than space shuttles. The diagnostic equipment alone costs more than most people make in 5 years." The man stepped forward with quiet confidence, his demeanor completely different from the humble supplicant who had asked for work in exchange for food just 24 hours earlier. "Hybrid system control module failure," he said calmly, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Conflict between the electric motor management software and the internal combustion engine control protocols. It's a known defect in the 2019 models, but McLaren never issued a public recall because the failure rate was considered statistically acceptable." The silence in the workshop was so complete that Emma could hear the traffic light changing on the street corner outside. She quickly accessed the shop's computer system and searched for the specific problem the man had described, her fingers flying across the keyboard with desperate urgency. What she found made her gasp audibly. "Confidential technical service bulletin that only authorized McLaren dealers were supposed to have access to," describing exactly the problem he had identified with the same technical language and precision he had used. "How do you know about that service bulletin?" Kevin asked, arriving for work and overhearing the conversation that was rapidly spiraling beyond his understanding. "That information is restricted to factory-certified technicians. It's not available to the general public, and it's not something you could find by searching the internet." The man hesitated with that same evasive look they'd seen before, as if he was constantly calculating how much truth he could safely reveal without exposing himself to consequences he wasn't prepared to face. "I've worked extensively with hybrid performance vehicles," he said carefully, his answer technically true but deliberately incomplete. Victoria noticed the tension building in the room and decided to take control of the situation before it deteriorated further. "Gentlemen, if your shop isn't capable of repairing my car, I'm perfectly willing to take it somewhere else. I've already spent 6 months and $30,000 at various facilities without getting any closer to a solution. I'm not interested in wasting any more time or money on people who can't deliver results." No, Oliver said hastily, recognizing the potential disaster of losing such a wealthy and well-connected customer. "Of course, we want to work on your car. It's just that." He gestured helplessly at the man, struggling to find words that would express his confusion without sounding completely incompetent. "It's just that he claimed yesterday that his knowledge was all show and no substance. That Anyone could do what I did with enough luck and the right guesses. The man's calm response carried an undertone that made Oliver's blood pressure spike. I suggested we could make a practical demonstration instead of arguing about theoretical possibilities. What kind of demonstration? Victoria asked. Her interest clearly piqued by the possibility of finally getting her expensive car repaired by someone who seemed to understand its complex systems. The man looked directly at Oliver, his eyes showing a confidence that hadn't been there during yesterday's humiliation. If I successfully diagnose and repair Ms. Hamilton's McLaren within 4 hours, you give me a real opportunity to prove my abilities, not for a sandwich, but for legitimate employment, doing work that matches my actual skill level. If I fail, I'll leave permanently and never return, and you can document my failure however you choose. Oliver looked at Victoria, then back at the man, his mind racing through the potential consequences of accepting such a public challenge. If the stranger failed, Oliver would be vindicated in front of an important customer and could restore his damaged credibility. If the stranger succeeded, well, Oliver preferred not to think about that possibility. What happens if you can't fix it? He asked, trying to buy time to think of a way out of the situation that was rapidly getting beyond his control. If I can't repair the car correctly, the man replied with absolute calm, I'll admit my limitations publicly, apologize for wasting everyone's time, and you'll have video evidence of my failure that you can share wherever you think appropriate. Emma watched the negotiation with fascination, recognizing that this was about much more than automotive repair. There were undercurrents of pride, prejudice, and personal history flowing beneath the surface of what appeared to be a straightforward business discussion. The stakes felt enormous, though she couldn't entirely explain why. All right, Oliver finally agreed, his voice tight with tension and barely controlled anxiety. You have 4 hours to diagnose and repair a problem that 5 different shops couldn't solve. But when you fail and you will fail, I want you gone for good. The man nodded and walked over to the McLaren with movements that showed an almost religious reverence, as if he were approaching something sacred rather than merely expensive. His hands touched the car's sleek surface with the gentleness of someone reuniting with an old friend after years of forced separation, and Emma noticed that his entire posture changed as he began his examination. The submissive, apologetic demeanor of the previous day was replaced by focused professionalism that radiated competence and authority. Victoria approached Emma while the man began his diagnostic work. There's something quite remarkable about this gentleman, she said quietly, her voice carrying genuine admiration. Last night, when he explained the problems with my car, it was like listening to a master craftsman discussing his life's work. He didn't just understand the technical issues, he understood the soul of the machine, if that makes any sense to you. Emma nodded, watching as the man opened the McLaren's hood with precise, confident movements that suggested years of familiarity with such vehicles. May I ask how exactly you two met, Ms. Hamilton? Emma inquired, her curiosity about the stranger's background growing stronger with every passing moment. Victoria's expression softened with something that looked like maternal concern. He was sitting on the curb outside my hotel, looking at a small photograph and crying very quietly. When I approached to see if I could help, he asked me if I had children. When I told him about my daughter, he said he'd lost his own child many years ago and had been trying to find some kind of purpose or meaning in his life ever since. The revelation hit Emma like a physical blow, suddenly illuminating aspects of the stranger's behavior that had puzzled her. The sadness in his eyes, the way he talked about cars as if they were more than mechanical objects. His willingness to accept humiliation without fighting back, it all made sense now. He was carrying a grief so profound that everything else in his life had become secondary to the weight of his loss. Meanwhile, the man worked on the McLaren with a total concentration that mesmerized everyone in the shop. his every movement calculated and purposeful, like a surgeon performing a life-saving operation. 4 hours passed like 4 minutes. The workshop had filled with tension as thick as fog, everyone watching and waiting for either vindication or catastrophe. When the man finally looked up from the McLaren's complex hybrid system, his eyes showed a satisfaction that he hadn't displayed since first appearing at their shop. "Finished," he said simply, wiping his hands on a clean towel with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly what he had accomplished. Victoria started the car, and the difference was immediately apparent to everyone present. Where before there had been hesitation, strange noises, and system conflicts, now there was only the smooth, controlled power that the vehicle had been designed to deliver. "My God," Victoria whispered, tears forming in her eyes as she listened to the perfect synchronization between the electric motors and gasoline engine. 5 different facilities told me it was impossible to repair without replacing the entire hybrid control system for over $100,000. They said the software conflicts were too complex to resolve and that the car would never function properly again. Oliver stood in stunned silence, watching his worldview crumble in real time. Kevin and Brandon looked like they had witnessed something supernatural, their faces showing the kind of awe usually reserved for religious experiences. Emma, however, was beginning to piece together a puzzle much larger and more significant than automotive repair. That afternoon, as the man prepared to leave after politely declining any payment from Victoria beyond the meal he had originally requested, Emma caught up with him on the sidewalk outside the shop. "Wait," she called, her voice carrying an urgency that surprised even her. "I need to ask you something important, and I hope you'll be honest with me." He stopped walking, but didn't turn around completely, his posture suggesting someone perpetually ready to flee from uncomfortable conversations. "You're not an ordinary mechanic, are you?" Emma asked directly, deciding that subtle approaches weren't going to work with someone who had perfected the art of evasive answers. He was silent for several long seconds, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the accumulated weight of years of carefully guarded secrets and deliberately forgotten achievements. "I've been many things in my life," he said quietly. "Mechanic was never one of them." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession that had been waiting years to be spoken aloud. "Then what were you?" Emma pressed, sensing that she was close to understanding something fundamentally important about this mysterious man, who had appeared in their lives like a force of nature disguised as human vulnerability. For a moment, when he turned to look at her directly, Emma saw past the unkempt appearance, past the sadness, past the resignation that had become his protective armor. She saw a man who had once commanded machines worth millions of dollars at speeds that defied human comprehension, who had tasted victory on the world's greatest stages and experienced losses that had redefined the meaning of tragedy. "I was someone who believed that speed could cure any kind of pain," he replied, his words carrying echoes of a philosophy that had once driven him to extraordinary achievements and ultimate devastation. "Until I learned that some wounds only heal when you stop running from them and face what you've done." He walked away into the gathering dusk, leaving Emma standing alone on the sidewalk, finally understanding that she had just met someone whose story was far deeper and more tragic than anyone in their small world could have imagined. That night, Emma returned to her computer with a new theory and a specific name to search for. When the sun rose the next morning, she had made a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew.